The little potatoes. The little yellow gold potatoes. Or just regular potatoes. Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah, but I thought it looked like a little one. 3 sticks of butter. 450.
Sorry, I'm a little behind. How's everyone doing this morning? Very good, very good. We have a lot of things to be thankful for, a lot of really good opportunities on the horizon. We'll kind of talk about that more a little bit later. And it's not because Lum's not here. That's actually a bad thing. But nonetheless, we'll start with a word of prayer. I think, Jim, if you can lead us in that prayer, and then we'll begin. Amen. Thank you. Nowadays, if you look at entertainment and media, one of the biggest things that kids rave about are zombies, the undead, the supernatural. And while that seems kind of strange, if people were to connect that idea with Christianity, there is also a similar concept that we focus on every single week, and it's the idea of resurrection. Now, the idea of Jesus being resurrected from the dead does not imply he was a zombie. But he was the very first individual to die without sin, be raised without sin, and he's still waiting to come back and receive us to him, again appearing for the second time, as Paul would tell us, without sin. There's something unique and special about the resurrection as we look in our last lesson in our booklet, which, by the way, the new workbooks are on the table if you want to pick those up. We're going to be looking at the second half of the book of Psalms. We'll be looking at some selective psalms. So pick up that book, read through it a little bit. Honestly, what I'm going to do, I may go by the book. I may write a different lesson. I don't know. It just depends on how I feel about it. We'll see how that goes. So pick that up. We'll start that next week, Lord willing. But the resurrection, if we think about a life that is devoted to Jesus, then you will live a life that is called the resurrected life. As all of you know, in 2 Corinthians 5, it would tell us that there is something that avails in the life to come, and that is a new creation that avails in 2 Corinthians 5, 14 through 17. And because we are to become like Jesus, not just in our life now, but we are to become like Jesus even after we have committed to him, what does that process look like? In fact, what does that entail as we look through the beginning portion of the proclamation of the resurrection of Jesus? We know where to live righteously. We know where to live faithfully. But what's the big deal and what started all of this? Well, we're going to look at a couple of different passages, and we'll start with Matthew chapter 27. Matthew chapter 27, and what we're going to find out 3 different types of disciples that can be formed or devoted to Jesus. Matthew chapter 27 is going to be our first passage of interest. where we see that sometimes, in light of the resurrected Lord, one must have courageous devotion. Courageous devotion. I want you to notice in Matthew 27, beginning in verse number 57. Matthew 27, verse number 57. Now when the evening had come, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who himself had become a disciple of Jesus. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus, and Pilate commanded the body to be given him. And when Joseph had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his new tomb, which he had hewn out of the rock, and he rolled a large stone against the door and departed. And again, Mary Magdalene was there, and the other Mary sitting opposite of the tomb. Now, when I read this text, there's a couple of things that come to mind. Number one, it begins with this idea of a rich man. As Jesus has already died, he's passed from the crucifixion, we find that it starts with a rich man. Now, what does the beginning of the Beatitudes say? Blessed are those who are what in spirit? Poor. Now, in Matthew 5 and Luke 6, when it makes that statement, it's not necessarily talking about those who are they're not well endowed financially. That's not what that passage is about. But the idea of the poor. Jesus would tell his disciples, the poor and the lame you will have with you always. What does the Bible normally say about individuals who are rich? Huh? Hard for them to get to heaven? Oh, you were saying the same thing. Okay, why is it hard for them? Yeah, they find that if they put their trust in their earthly wealth and their possessions, that they'll be fine. Well, in the long run, that might help you in your life here, but that's not going to help you in the life to come, let alone when you stand before God on Judgment Day. Doesn't matter how big of a check you can write. Money is an earthly possession that will just fade away in time. Now, we wish it didn't fade away as fast when you get paid, But still, the Bible would warn us not to be covetous about money. In fact, most people will misquote what Timothy was told. They will say that money is the root of all evil. Well, according to Paul, it's the love of money. If that's all you can think about, it's not good. Now, money can do a lot of things, not just dilute one's trust and where it needs to go. It could also be an aspect of what it does to one's attitude towards other people. I've worked hard for this money, so you have to do the same. I have no compassion or sympathy towards you because I am where I am, because I put myself here. Well, even the Bible would tell us, James is a very important book for this aspect. Not to be lofty-minded, even though you may be rich, or to be high-minded is how it's portrayed. But we're to think of being rich as looking at the field, looking at the grass, and considering one day it's going to burn up, it's going to go away. Well, Joseph of Arimathea did not have that mindset. Now, being a rich man is one strike against him in terms of what we may deem to be, here's the ideal disciple. But there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, in Acts 4, we would find individuals who sold their possessions, and they would give those possessions for the glory of the church. And in light of the things that we own and things that come in our possession, we should try to magnify as much as possible what we have for the glory of God and the expansion of the kingdom. And in light of those things, in Acts 4, there were individuals such as, not Barnabas. Yeah, Barnabas. What's Barnabas known for? This is not Barabbas, Barnabas. Yeah, he went with Paul. Now, do we know what happened at the beginning of his journey? Ooh, learning time. Okay, let's go to Acts chapter 4. Acts chapter 4, verse number 32. Now, this is after Peter and John are arrested, and they're sent back, and we normally, at the end of this text, in verse 23, we read about this prayer of boldness. Lord, let us have boldness, that we may be able to stand before our enemies. But notice in verse number 32, the aftermath. how did they continue sharing in boldness and showing boldness? Now, the multitude of those who believed were of one heart and one soul. Neither did anyone say that any of the things he possessed was his own, but that they had all things in common. And with great power, the apostles gave witness to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, what we're talking about today, and there was great grace upon all of them. Now, nor was there anyone among them who lacked, for all who were possessors of lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of the things that were sold and laid them at the apostles' feet. And they distributed to each one as anyone had need. And Joseph, who was also named Barnabas by the apostles, which is translated son of encouragement, a Levi of the country of Cyprus, having land, sold it, brought the money, and laid it at the apostles' feet. Now, what we see here is two different things. There's one idea of what Barnabas is doing here. Barnabas is literally selling what he has, and he's giving it all to become a missionary. And we find this across the book of Acts, that that's what he does the rest of his life. Now, that's also interesting because what tribe was he from? He was a Levite. What had he done his entire life before the new law? He was a priest. He was in service to God anyways, all throughout his life. And now that it's no longer a duty of just a tribe, but everyone who is a child of God, there are some individuals we would find once they became Christians, they didn't commit themselves entirely to the service the same way that Barnabas did. Barnabas took his lifelong habits and continued those things in becoming a missionary for the church. Now, that's one aspect of what we read here. There's another aspect here where we see people selling lands and houses. These are things that are extra. Now, could they have used the money for themselves? Yeah, and if you read the beginning of chapter 5, that's what happens with Ananias and Sapphira. Not so much that they kept things back, that they could have. Even Peter said, while it was yours, you could do what you wanted to with it. And there's no guilt trip in that. But what they did wrong is that they said they sold it for this amount when really they only gave a much smaller amount. And they thought that they could fool the Lord and pull the wool over everyone's eyes. So basically, they were trying to keep up with the original Jones and Smith family. That's not it. Hold on. Who are we keeping up with? Joneses. There it is. Okay, not the Smiths. That's an illustration. Okay, so keeping up with the Joneses, trying to look like they're being faithful just as much as everyone else, which, they could have still been faithful, said that they only gave so much and not as much as they had claimed that they had given. Nothing wrong with that. But what we see with the background of Barnabas here is that in light of him being a Levite, he gave himself over to a missionary aspect. So in light of giving, two different things. People either sold extra things for the sake of the kingdom, or they sold what they had so that they would give the rest of their life in service to God. Both of those are admirable and honorable, but there's not one that's greater than the other. It's just different choices in life. Now, what does that do with Joseph? I want you to look back at Matthew 27. Not only do we find that Joseph of Arimathea was a rich man. In fact, Arimathea was an area that we find, according to archaeology, this is where very noble bloodline, or I guess nobility families would come from. So very rich and very prosperous individuals. These are people who made an impact in the government aspect. Well, he comes from this very high place. And if you think of individuals you have met who live in a very rich community, what is normally the consensus of people in that community? How do they act? What's their attitude? They're very stuck up. They're very prideful, and they're not shy to show you everything that they have. Well, there's nothing wrong with showing people, but gloating about it, that's a different thing. Joseph didn't do that. In fact, even though he came from a community that would have been known for that, and even though he was a rich man, I want you to notice another thing. He himself had become a disciple of Jesus. Now, this is interesting because if I look at the account of the rich man who followed Jesus, He had great possessions, and he went away sorrowful because he didn't want to sell those things. This implies Joseph, though he was still a rich man, chose to make sacrifices to follow Jesus. You can be rich and be a disciple of Jesus. It's a matter of how you work with the finances that God gives you is the idea. But I also want you to notice he has the end of his life in mind. Notice what it tells us about this man. Verse number 58, he asked for the body of Jesus. We'll come back to that here in a moment. Verse 59, he had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth. Now this is a man of nobility. I've never seen, well, I take it back. I've seen very, very few. Enough to count on one hand. I don't see that many people who make a ton of money getting in the trenches and getting their hands dirty. You have a man who is rich, and he takes the body of Jesus himself. Now, what's the condition of Jesus' body right now? I know he's dead, but what's the condition of his body? What does it look like? What's all over it? Blood. You have a rich man who doesn't care about that. He's more focused on, my Lord has been crucified. He got his hands dirty. In fact, probably drenched in blood. His cloak dirty as well. And in going before the king in light of all this, he did not consider his position to be something worth exalting for. I want you to notice in verse number 60, he didn't take his position into consideration, but also verse 60, he laid it in a new tomb which he had hewn out of the rock. Now he had hewn it. This could be one of two things. Either he paid a very pretty penny and dug this out himself. Really, he mined it out himself. Or he spent a pretty penny to hire other people to make this exactly how he wanted for his family. Now, I want you to really pay close attention to this. If you bought a burial plot and you permitted someone who you've known them in your life, they become very dear to you, and you give them, when they pass, you give them your burial spot. What are you including them in if you're doing that? Family. Joseph considered Jesus his family. Now that's the kind of relationship we have to have with Jesus. He is not just someone who is a part of my life. He is my life. He is my family. Now, in light of the pretty penny that he spent, and regardless of his reputation and being rich, he was still called a disciple of Jesus. And no other rich individual, with the exception of Nicodemus, it's not mentioned here, but if you look at Luke's account, we'll find that Nicodemus gave 100 pounds of myrrh to anoint the wrapped body of Jesus. In fact, it would even call him at that time, he was a disciple of Jesus as well. So the man who came to Jesus at night finally took a stand in the public eye for his Lord. Now, Joseph, though he was rich, he didn't consider his integrity to be a thing worth boasting about. He humbled himself, but also he used his own possession and times for his time for his passion for the Lord. Now, I know the resurrection mainly focuses on the power of God through Jesus. But look at a deeper meaning through this. The power of Jesus through a disciple who has all the resources in the world, and he gives them all to Jesus. That's very humbling. And what a powerful example of discipleship. So in light of the resurrection, and this is another idea as well, we've not even gotten to the third day. This is the day that Jesus died. Where were the 12? This was not one of the apostles. In fact, another text we'll find out, let me see if I can give you the reference. Mark chapter 15, verse number 42 and 43, it would tell us that Joseph of Arimathea, now this is another interesting strike that we would say is against him. He was a prominent council member of the Pharisees. What's the big deal with the Pharisees in the time of Jesus? Were they the best people? They thought they were. They had that thing called pride. They had a holier than thou art mentality and mindset. Joseph didn't do that. In fact, I believe what we would find, it's not in Mark's text. Okay, Luke 23, verse 50, would not only tell us that he was a council member of the Pharisees, but also he had not consented to their decision and deed. Now, this is interesting. The Bible makes a distinction between what they thought they were going to do and what they did. In fact, there is another example of that idea in Genesis 4 when Cain would desire to kill Abel, and he hadn't sinned yet. God didn't hold that thought against Cain. He just said, whoa, hold on, sin lies at the door and its desire is for you, but you can control it. But he didn't. So I find two different things. Not only did he consent and even more than likely try to persuade them, do not kill this innocent man. But when they finally did the deed, then what did he do in response? Did he freeze because the people in power had killed his Lord? He took the power into his own hands and he buried his Lord. Now, again, devotion, the power of devotion, a man of prominence, a man of provision, and a man of devotion to his master. This is, in light of all the betrayals and the forsaking of the disciples, this is one of the people who shine the brightest in a group that was the enemies of Jesus. And he said, absolutely not. My Lord is worth much more than that. And I find that interesting. In what seems like a death to discipleship is really a resurrection in the light, or the darkest of times, to be a small light that says, I still believe. Powerful, powerful. Now, let's look at Matthew 28, and we will find the rest of the story. In Matthew 28, also in John 21 and Luke 23, we'll find the resurrection day of Jesus. Mark 16 is another passage to keep in mind. But I want you to consider our character of interest, Mary Magdalene. Matthew 28, beginning in verse 1. Now after the Sabbath, as the first day of the week began to dawn, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the tomb. Now we just read about that in verse 61 of the prior chapter. Mary and the other Mary sat opposite of the tomb. They were watching this whole time, probably asking questions. What are they really doing with his body? So behold, verse 2, there was a great earthquake, and an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone from the door and sat on it. His countenance was like lightning, and his clothing as white as snow, and the guards shook for fear of him and became like dead men. But the angel answered and said to the women, do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He's not here, for he is risen. As he said, come see the place where the Lord lay. And go quickly, tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead, and indeed he is going before you into Galilee, and there you will see him. Behold, I have told you. So they went out quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy, and ran to bring his disciples word. And as they went to tell his disciples, behold, Jesus met them, saying, rejoice. So they came and held him by the feet and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, do not be afraid. Go and tell my brethren to go to Galilee, and there they will see me. Now there seems to be a description in the text. If you compare John 20 with Matthew 28, what you'll find is that Mary Magdalene was alone. According to the book of Luke, let me see if I can get you the reference. It's going to take me a few seconds. According to the book of Luke, I'll get you a reference later, Mary Magdalene apparently had 7 demons cast out of her. Normally one of the good things, well, it's not really good things, but a good point to bring out in light of Mary, is that if you consider the people in your life or people you have seen that you may not be very close to, but you know that they've got a reputation of sorts. And you know that they get involved with activities that Christians would not get involved with. And your mindset would be, don't waste your time trying to give them the gospel. They're not going to accept it. And I understand there's a principle from Matthew 7, 1 through 4 there. But if you could imagine 7 demons in one woman, consider the actions an ungodly woman would do who does not know the Lord. Consider the words that would come out of her mouth. And she's the only one with another woman at the tomb. 7 demons. Jesus said, seems lost to the world, but what I see is someone who needs Jesus. And she became one of the greatest disciples that followed Jesus. Now, despite her past, John 20 would tell us that Mary Magdalene, when she saw the open tomb, started crying. And then the 2 angels are there saying, "Woman, why do you weep?" Well, they've taken my master's body, or the body of my Lord. I don't know where they've taken him. Well, he's risen. Well, that didn't console her. And then the gardener, quotation marks, came up behind Mary and said her name. And she thought that wasn't Jesus, but when she heard her name by the gardener, Jesus, she rejoiced and said, "Rabbi." Now, Jesus said, "Don't touch me, for I've not yet ascended to my Father." It seems like she went in for a hug. And the reason I say that is when you look down at Matthew 28 and verse number 9 and 10, as they went to tell his disciples, behold, Jesus met them, saying, "Rejoice." They came and held him by the feet and worshiped him. It's as if, though the embrace was not permitted at that time, worship was. And when you think about what we do on the first day of the week, we are bowing at the feet of Jesus. That's the whole point. In fact, in everything that we do, whether Bible class or worship or any other event that we have where it is called an assembly, we are choosing to bow at our Master's feet and give him the proper praise that is due him. Now, there's a couple other things to keep in mind as well. We could look at the guards. We could look at how they basically became like dead men. They didn't die, verse 4. But essentially, they fainted, was the idea. In fact, who told the Jews later on in verse number 11 through 15, who told the Jews that Jesus had risen from the dead? The guards who were there. Now, they paid them off, or tried to pay them off. In fact, it would tell us in verse number 15 that the lie that they tried to spread through the guards is still spoken to this day. But then if you think 2,000 years beyond this time, there's still individuals who believe Jesus has risen from the grave, and there are still individuals who believe he never did. That hasn't changed. So, what are they being covetous over if they believe that he hasn't risen from the grave? Well, in this text, I can't presume people's motives. But in this text, again, money. Money killed the heart of 2 guards. Now, money had already killed the heart of the people who were against Jesus in spreading this lie, but it didn't kill Joseph. It actually exalted Joseph because, again, he used those possessions for the glory of God. So when I look at Mary Magdalene here, in comparison to those things, she had little to nothing. At times, she would travel with Jesus along with a couple other women who would help to provide meals or take care of things from time to time as needed. But then there's also another incredible aspect, and I like to compare this to Genesis 3. Who committed the first sin? Eve. Now, I don't know if you have siblings, but I tend to be told my mistakes from my childhood over and over and over. I've just learned to laugh at it and then in my heart hold grudges the rest of my life. But there's stories I don't enjoy living back through. If we go all the way back to creation and people are trying to figure out why did we get in this mess? Well, it's all Eve's fault. And this comes from people who are unable to take self-responsibility. It's all Eve's fault. If Eve hadn't done what she had done, we wouldn't be in this mess. Do you know who God chose to proclaim the first ever message, he is risen from the dead? A woman. A woman. Why am I so focused on the beginning mess up when I should be focused on the beginning of the greatest good news ever to be proclaimed to mankind? God chose in redeeming women to be not only just, it's not a faded memory of you messed up. It is a glorious memory of praise the Lord. He's returned. He is resurrected. There's now salvation through this one called Jesus. I think God was trying to redeem the name of women. And it's a beautiful story. One who has a terrible past now has a beautiful future in that she too is remembered. In this case, Mary Magdalene, she too is remembered not for her past mistakes, but for the passion for her master. And we don't really read anything about Mary Magdalene after this text, but I don't think I need to. But I would find it very interesting to have been there with them to see Jesus for the first time. Now, there's also another sad indication. And men, this is nothing against us, but this is an observation that I have. It is the hardest thing to get men to be motivated for God. Women tend to be, historically and even now, women tend to be more passionate for the Lord than men. I don't know why. It's nothing against us. Nothing against us. But over time, that's what I've observed. Now, we have really great people here. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying from observation. There are only 2 women here at the tomb of Jesus, after he's already told his apostles and his disciples, some of the more innermost disciples, he's going to raise from the dead. Now, if you know your Lord's going to be at, let's make a strike and heal. Do y'all remember when Trump did a speech at Freedom Hall? And he came to Tri-Cities Airport. How did the news in the area respond to that? They were all over it. If you were at the airport, man, there were people who were filming. They had the, whatever his private guards are, they had the whole perimeter cleared, and people were just taking pictures. I've got one. My sister couldn't make it to Freedom Hall, but she did make it to the airport, and she sent pictures. Oh, it's Trump, it's Trump. And they got in his little Trump-mobile, and he made his way down to Freedom Hall. Actually, one of Mom's neighbors was the one who drove him there, and I was like, oh, what an honor. But people were crazy about it. In fact, there were people lined out the door because they knew the president, or at least the future president, what they said at the time, was coming to Freedom Hall. This is incredible. This is incredible. The Lord of Lords, the King of Kings, the Master of the universe, the Creator of all things, the one who could tell you anything you ever did and redeem you and love you, is raising from the dead. And guess how the masses, or how many of the masses, appeared to see that? 4, technically. 2 fainted guards and 2 women. What does that really indicate about people? I heard someone do a lesson on the resurrection. It was a Easter lesson. And he was talking about from the perspective of God. And this is something we have to work on in light of how we mature as Christians. And I would hope you would feel the same way toward me as well. The people that we tend to put trust in and we have confidence in light of their faith and their example and how we feel toward them, when they mess up and it hurts us inside and it loses a little bit of trust toward them, and even I thought you would do better than this, but you didn't. And normally you hear that from a parent toward a child, but brothers and sisters in Christ toward one another, how we are forbearing and long-suffering with one another. Look throughout the epistles. That's one of the main things that's listed every time. Be long-suffering with one another. I can't force you to change, but I hope you wouldn't force me to change at the same time. It is a give and take relationship. And as we work on developing that give and take thing, I think through the ministry of Jesus, how many times Jesus thought there was so much more they could have done, and his disciples still would let him down. How he would still love them and feel about them. Could you imagine how excited Jesus would be in that he is risen from the dead, And I know he knows all things, but I think he prepared himself for the great disappointment when he saw 2. Just 2. Which means it's not about numbers. It's about devotion. And that's something we have to keep in mind as well. Will numbers come in time if we have a passion for the Lord and we do what is our duty to do? Yes. That's why I am really against the idea of attendance numbers or finances. They're good for bookkeeping and bookmarking type things, but it's not about the numbers. I mean, that's great, but it's about doing the work. If we do the work, the numbers will come in time. I don't have to worry about that. But if I do what is necessary for me to do as the Master requires, there will be disappointments, but there will be victories. In fact, 1 Corinthians 3 is a good text to look at because it talks about 2 different types of Christians. Ones who labor in trying to save souls and people choose to obey, and they receive the eternal crown. But then you have people who are trying to save souls and people reject their work. And there's really, they would say, nothing to show for their labor. But they receive an eternal crown as well. What's the point? Some people are going to commit, some people are not. It doesn't mean that you're more effective than the other person. What it simply means is that when you do your work, not every plant that you plant or seed that you plant is going to blossom into what you hope it will become. I need to become prepared and be realistic in my expectations of sowing the seed. Jesus set himself what should have been one of the greatest celebratory events of all time. Didn't happen. Didn't happen. And when he finally met with the 12, I know in some texts, at least in John 21 and Luke 24, he would berate his disciples for saying, "Why are you slow of hearing and dull of heart? I told you I was going to be resurrected, and none of you were there. You went out and did your own thing." There were 2 there, and I don't know what happened to them, but I know they were excited for the whole thing. In fact, even the first word Jesus says in this text, in Matthew 27, verse number 9, what did he say? Rejoice. That's a good news. That's something to be excited about. But only 2. And I think Jesus rejoices more in those small victories than he does in what we would deem, no, we need to have just one super major event. Well, I find some of the greatest things in my life, especially in this thing called personal development, I got to do it a little bit at a time. If I try to do a drastic cold turkey type thing, it never really works for me because I have to develop the habits over time. Well, in our spiritual walk, it's the same thing. We've got to take small chunks a little bit at a time. In fact, think of the ark. How many people were saved? 8 in comparison to what was the estimated population? Pop quiz. Billions. I don't know how many billions, but billions. Billions and only 8 are saved. Is that God's fault? Your choices matter. But do know that there's power in the few. There is great power in the few. So when I look at Mary, she did not consider it to be terrible that it was just her and another person. That may have bothered her. I don't know. Why weren't the others there? I don't know. But I do find that they were there on the first day of the week. Just as Jesus said it would happen, it happened. And as their blessing of sorts, where sin entered into the world through woman, so did salvation through Jesus also began to be proclaimed through women devoted to the Lord. So if I look at Joseph of Arimathea, using provisions, regardless of what God has given you, using provisions and one's power, throwing the power aside and humbling yourself to give all to Jesus, and even one who was with few people, being the one who Scriptures would honor for eternity by saying, you get to be the first to proclaim the good news. Now, there is another aspect that we don't have time to get into. Luke 24, 44 through 53. Basically, the gist of that text deals with how can I continue learning about knowing that the resurrection was going to happen even before the New Testament, and how I can continue to be reminded of the resurrection even after the Gospels. Look back into the books of Moses, the Psalms, and the prophets. They speak of a coming Messiah, of a slain Savior, and a resurrected Lord. And when that day would appear, then there would be this great light given to the Gentiles. There will be this good news and new way open where God would call them in, Jeremiah 31 through 34. And that message would continue into, if you read, I think it's like verse 44 through 46 of Luke 24, it tells you how to continue the story beyond the resurrection of Jesus. And that story continues through people who themselves choose to be resurrected with Jesus. 1 Peter 3, verse 21. So if I look at the story of the resurrection, it does not just centrally involve around a tomb. It does. But that story must continue. In fact, what we're going to do a little bit later on this morning is do in remembrance of me. People who have chosen to be resurrected through Jesus are going to be thankful for the life, the death, and the resurrection of, and the future coming of, the resurrected Lord. So that's all the time that we have. I hope you will continue reading and studying this over time, where he walked. I find looking at the life of Jesus to be one of the most empowering things to study, and it just teaches me so much every time that I go through his life. So keep these books, at least for your study and library. Don't forget to pick up a book on the Psalms. Don't pick up the book of Psalms, but pick up a workbook on Psalms, and we'll begin that, Lord willing, next week. So thank you all for your time and attention. We'll be back in 15 minutes.